Mr.
Well,
Dabson.
yes.
This is Sean Park with the Institute for Rural Affairs. I'm sure Teresa will be here as soon as she can get back in, but if you want to go ahead, if you want to go ahead and start, I'm recording it for them. So.
Okay, thank you. I wasn't sure whether we should wait for Teresa or not, but okay, let us proceed. You've joined a session on collaborative rural development and regional economic connectivity. Thank you very much for joining, particularly if you sat through my piece this morning. I'm Brian Dabson, now an independent policy analyst and researcher. Have a somewhat complicated background in public, private, and non-profit community and economic development over many years. I won't dwell on any of that. I think that's all in the materials. So I'd like to get on and just talk a little more detail about some of the issues and points that I made this morning. As I mentioned this morning, I want to talk about some of the findings of our research on regional collaboration, which took place a couple of years ago, and we had a fascinating period of time where teams of us were out in different parts of the country. And I think I explained this morning that we did have a long list of about 50 or 60 sites, and eventually through a lot of due diligence and application of criteria, we ended up with 7, plus a separate consultation in the Delta region, thanks to the Federal Reserve Board in St. Louis. So here are the 7 case studies, their locations, and I want to go through each of them in turn quickly, just to give you a flavor of what we thought was special about them, and hopefully I can get through this relatively quickly, because I'm just as interested in hearing your reflections on this notion of regional collaboration. This morning I highlighted what I think are the 5 biggest takeaways from what makes effective regional collaboration: the trusted and inclusive regional leadership, the connecting the dots, recognizing the contributions that rural makes to the regional economy, efforts to address geographic and racial inequities, and investing for the long term. And each of these characteristics appears, plus others, in the case studies as we go forward. So I want to start up in the Pacific Northwest with a community development financial institution called Craft 3. It's been around for about getting on for 30 years, and it is a CDFI with a very explicit mission to create social, economic, and environmental benefit across a big region, mainly Washington and Oregon, although it has done some work beyond those in Idaho. Its primary function is to provide capital for businesses and community facilities and consumers that need it. But what makes this CDFI special in my mind, and I've spent quite a bit of time there myself with the organization, is the intentionality of its strategies, using money, investment dollars, in a way which attempt to bridge the rural-urban divide, build trust, and work collaboratively with public partners, with a number of tribes and native nations in the Pacific Northwest, and private and nonprofit partners, and using their money also to try and tackle some of the social and economic inequities in the region. One of the things I think was interesting is that they do not have a central location. It would be so easy for them to set up an office and have everybody located in Portland or Seattle. But in fact, although they do have offices there, they also have number of other offices scattered around in quite small rural communities as well as mid-sized towns in the region, and that there isn't a single place where the expertise lies. So it's just as likely that one of the small rural centers is also the center for underwriting or something of that nature. So I particularly like this because they have quite a large portfolio of investments and assets under management, but they don't use it as if they're a bank. They deliberately look out some of the issues which are really challenging, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's inadequate sewer systems, whether it's the lack of community facilities on reservations. But they don't do it on their own. They don't see themselves as they just see themselves as a sort of a partner with states, the two state governments and different departments, with the tribes, with banks, with community development corporations, with economic development corporations in different parts. So they are an organization which lives and breathes the sort of principles that I was describing to you, and underscores that the leadership doesn't have to come from any particular sector or type of partner. It's just who emerges from the issues and the structures in the area. Also in the Pacific Northwest is an organization called Sustainable Northwest. This has been doing work in conflict resolution, in economic development and environment for 30 years. Some of you, older ones, will remember the spotted owl controversy of many years ago, 30 years ago, which brought to a halt all logging in the Pacific Northwest forests. And it was a very bitter dispute. And we talked earlier about trust and relationships. But here, this was violent protest and contest between environmentalists from outside, from local communities, from logging companies and loggers, from just about everybody was fighting each other. And Sustainable Northwest actually stepped in to try and resolve conflicts almost community by community so that we could get the economy going again, but in a way which really promoted natural resource stewardship. Ultimately, they created a whole network of collaboratives across Oregon and Washington. And now we have a pretty productive and sustainable forestry industry once more. Not everybody's happy still, but through partnerships with the Forest Service, with the tribes, with a load of rural businesses and communities, and bringing on the environmental nonprofits, we've now got a situation which rural development has been restarted in these communities. And one specific thing they did, and we talked about supply chains earlier, is that they created their own nonprofit business called Sustainable Northwest Wood, which manages a sustainable supply chain from the actual forests and the communities who live there to high-end consumers in Portland, and particularly in Portland, supervising the supply chain from start to finish. So because of their expertise in conflict resolution and working with a whole range of different actors at the community level, they were able to create regional networks of collaboratives to keep this going 30 years later. In Sacramento, California, there is the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, SACOG. And one of the things they did a few years back was to create a rural urban connection strategy, or RUCS. This was two different things. One, it was a strategy for looking at growth and sustainability across the 4 to 6 county area from a rural perspective. Sustainability and growth had always been looked at from a city perspective before, together with a very important suite of data tools, initially for rural land use planning. But these data tools had the impact of bringing into focus the contribution that the fruit and vegetable industry made to the regional economy. This was underscored by a separate Brookings study, which was brought about by the metropolitan governments in Sacramento, and it said that the most important competitive industry you have in your region is actually food growing and food processing. In other words, the people in the city had not realized that they had $1 billion plus industry around them for which they were paying very little attention. This had real world consequences because it meant that budgetary decisions on resource allocation, particularly say in transportation, meant they were focused on commuting flows, but ignored largely the actual transportation needs of rural farmers and businesses in getting their goods to market. And given their contribution to, as a base industry, if you like, in the region, it meant that there was a need for a reorientation of where priorities go. Now, two things happened. One is that Sacramento now markets itself as the farm to fork capital of California, because it embraces the idea that the rural and urban are working together economically. And now there are collaborative regional efforts around the life sciences and agri-biotechnology. And on the right, there is a plan for a research and technology park built on this in one of the small towns in the outer counties of the Sacramento region. Also in California, and I mentioned this briefly this morning, is the San Joaquin Valley, the partnership. And this had a different sort of origin. It was from governor's executive order back in 2005 to try and to bring together 8 counties all along the San Joaquin Valley, which were feeling aggrieved because although they are major agricultural producer and have a whole set of issues to deal with, they were largely unheard of from the state capital. And so, they provide this sort of vehicle for looking at region-wide issues. Water supply is a critical one in the area, and increasingly things like renewable energy and broadband, and of course, like everywhere else, workforce development. So this partnership brings together state agencies, federal agencies, companies, as well as the 8 counties and others into this grouping, which has no regulatory or taxation powers. It can't force anyone to do anything. But those of you who work in councils of government and economic development corporations will recognize that the use of soft power, as we came to call it, was really important to pursue regional solutions. Sharing information, networking and learning, and negotiation. And in most cases, trying to leave political and other differences behind at the door as we're trying to figure out how to have this combined valley voice to state government and federal officials about what is needed to deal with the issues that the 8 county region faced. Moving over eastwards to Texas, we had a look at the Texas Panhandle, which is a 26 county, primarily rural region, both farming, ranching, and oil, and with one major center, which is the city of Amarillo. And I just mentioned a quote which came from one of our many interviews about Amarillo thinks regionally, we don't have a choice. It's a kind of necessity for that whole area. But one of the things that people were consciously aware of was the fact that all the activity and all the resources and investment still was focused in the bigger city. And so, interesting enough, some of the banks which serve both the city and the surrounding counties, plus the Amarillo Area Foundation, came together to try and figure out a regional approach, regional collaborative approach to actually expanding entrepreneurship and small business development across the 26 county area. It's too early to report on the success of this, just to say that it was an interesting origin in the sense of both the banks and the community foundation coming together and bringing along with them collaborative people focusing on entrepreneurship. They did a couple of pilots to begin with to see how to do it, and then over time they're beginning to figure out how to get to scale with supporting entrepreneurship in the more remote counties. Minnesota, we heard quite a bit about Minnesota this morning, and this is probably one of the most complex and I don't want to say advanced, but certainly it represents a lot of the things that I've been describing in terms of regional development ecosystems. And it began, like many of these others, 30 odd years ago, when the rural economy was really hurting through collapse of farm prices and the like. And the two big foundations in Minnesota, the Blandin and the McKnight foundations, decided that they needed to kickstart action across rural Minnesota, which in simple terms was largely defined as the area beyond the Twin Cities. And they established 6 what they called initiative foundations, regional foundations. Each of them were independent, and each of them responsible for figuring out what the needs were and how they were going to operate and develop resources in their region. And at the same time, the state set up a whole series of regional development organizations, and there was a conscious effort to relate the work of the initiative foundations with the regional development organizations. And one of the fora in which they did this was something called the Regional Economic Development Group, which still meets regularly to look at issues that are of concern across the state, supported by the universities and colleges and the state chamber, and also the Association of Development Organizations. So part of the success of this whole enterprise is that they've been very conscious about cultivating rural leaders. It's no good just creating infrastructure if there's no one locally to take up the mantle. And so cultivating rural leaders in their thousands, building organizational capacity, both in the initiative foundations, but in nonprofits and regional organizations, emphasizing knowledge sharing and communication, and really being conscious about bridging the urban-rural divide and tackling a lot of the issues which you're all familiar with, which face rural areas in different combinations. And as we talked about in the Q&A session, integrating funding streams so that we were not dealing with silos of funding and programs, but trying to pull it all together into an ecosystem. In Western North Carolina, the Land of Sky Regional Council, Council of Governments and Economic Development District, has been a catalyst and a coordinator for trying to bring broadband into a 4-county region around Asheville, North Carolina, up in the mountains. the challenge that the regional council had is that the state actively prohibited local governments getting involved in the broadband issue and in regulating, in partnering, and all the rest of it. But what they did do was, in a way, use soft power again to use their planning and convening role to bring together partnerships to really figure out how to make sure that any broadband expansion in Western North Carolina didn't just stay in the high growth area of Asheville, but went out to the rural counties in the mountains, where clearly there are challenges in topography and low densities in getting broadband out to these smaller communities. But this whole partnership worked with higher education, with private companies, schools and libraries and nonprofits to make sure that when the expansion took place, it would be just as beneficial to the rural as well as urban areas. And this was done as a regional initiative, a very strong collaborative initiative, but again, using soft power without any ability to use regulation or permitting or using sticks and carrots from the local government. So those are a quick run through of many of the things we saw. I will mention that the conversation that we had in the Delta was particularly interesting, because one of the things we really wanted to be able to see, particularly in relation to geographic and racial inequities, how all this regional collaboration approach worked in very high poverty areas with large minority populations. And unfortunately, although there are lots of very fine institutions in the Delta, they didn't work together in what we might call a regional collaboration. So we had a convening in Memphis where we pulled everyone together who worked in rural organizations, either CDCs or CDFIs or local governments, nonprofits of different sorts, and try to find out whether the principles or the learnings that we had from those other areas had any resonance with these communities in the Delta. And I have to say that it was an entirely positive response. The one thing, however, that came to the fore, and we've heard about this on the reservations and in the Southwest, is that there is a burden of history in this area, which took us through the civil rights and through to some of the unfortunate events of right now, which makes building trust and collaboration really hard, but particularly between poor Black communities and the area and the organizations which have the resources and the money. So again, from a question we had this morning, these efforts to achieve regional collaboration have to really bridge divides of trust and lack of inclusivity over generations. And so I don't have any rosy spectacles on this. It just demonstrates the work that needs to be done. And it also underscored the fact that rural America is so diverse and so many different circumstances around the country. But it seems on the face of it, and we'll see over time, whether these principles and perhaps a few others have some sort of universal applicability in terms of providing a roadmap of how to achieve effective regional collaboration. So at this point, I'd like to stop and invite you all to join me in the room with your pictures and your microphones, and give me, well, first I'd love to hear your reactions as to whether you think this is totally inappropriate for Illinois, or that you're doing this already and don't need somebody from North Carolina telling you what to do. But I'd be but I think what I'd really love is to get your take on these different principles and see whether how you think about them, how you're dealing with them in the state, and let's have a conversation. So Teresa, over to you as our moderator, now that you've returned.
I apologize. I don't even have an explanation for what happened. So sincere apologies for that. It looks like we do have a question from Bill. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you if you could. There you go. Unmute your mic.
Appreciate it. Brian, the building trust piece, do you have specific examples on that, on ways to do that? So I'll tell you right now, I am the director of a Chamber of Commerce, which is a regional chamber. We cover 3 counties in central Illinois. We've got an economic development group that covers the same 3 counties, also a regional economic development group. Our struggle is, and I was at a board meeting last night for one of the larger cities that we represent, and the comment was, we touched the stove once, we're not going to touch it again. We've been burned in the past.
Yeah.
Right. There was a business that went to the city next door. It didn't come to them. They felt like the carpet was pulled out from underneath of them. The conversations I've tried to have are with communities of our size. We can't compete with some of the suburbs of Chicago or Chicago itself. We don't have the resources, population or otherwise. So what's good for one community here is good for all of our communities, right? So if a business lands in the neighboring city, you're going to see the impact from increased residency, increased shopping in your shopping district. So you'll see the tax increases, the tax revenues, you'll see the income revenues. And I think that there's still a focus on, if the business doesn't land here, it doesn't matter to us. Have you seen examples, or can you share examples of some of the projects you shared earlier on how you can create that long-term trust factor when you've had cities or communities that have battled back and forth for decades?
Such a good point, Bill. And the first thing that jumps to mind is the question of the power of data and information. And I know that people are very skeptical of expertise and data these days, but if your region that you serve, along with those other organizations, are a genuine region, then they have an economic commonality. The economy, the social linkages and everything are all regional, and so the interests of one impacts the interests of another. And if it's possible to demonstrate that a business locating in one place employs people in another, generates supply linkages through to other counties, all those sorts of things, then that would be a start. And I talked about the Sacramento area, where they actually demonstrated through looking at supply chains, looking at where the money flows, that these rural counties really did make a huge contribution to the region and to each other. And so there was a way in which the data was really powerful. But in a way, what happened in Sacramento, we took an outside body employed by the city, the big city, to tell them that actually you've overlooked something really important here. You've overlooked the rural areas around. So maybe two or three things occur to me in your circumstance, and forgive me, because you've no doubt tried every one of these over time. But the fact that you have 3 organizations serving the same 3 counties suggests that either you've got a severe problem or you've got a great opportunity. And the great opportunity is that you've got three organizations which share some common ground about the future of those three counties. But it also could demonstrate that you've got a lot of slicing and dicing, which is preventing a really effective community regional effort. Part of this is a function of how each of the organizations was established, where it gets its money from, and who's on the boards and all the rest of it. But it seems as though it might be an opportunity at some point to figure out whether it'd be possible to reconfigure your organizational structure in the area and not only combine the resources of these three organizations in some effective way, but also have a look at who's at the table, because I suspect that it's the same sort of usual suspects who are on these boards, and that it may not be as quite as comprehensive as some of the issues and challenges you're facing in that region. And bringing new people into the mix might help to overcome some of this historical grievance that you described in your area. Please push back and say I'm talking absolute nonsense, but on the basis of no knowledge, those seem to be the things that really occurred to me.
No, I appreciate the input, and that's fair. I think it's more of the opportunity that you mentioned than the other. We're all limited on resources. Staff of 2 here, staff of 1.5, 1 at our EDC. The conversation comes to our municipalities really, and how we get them to work together.
Right.
So yeah. The goal is that we set the example, and we work in collaboration as organizations, and then they see that it's just, you've got a history of one business went to another city, that city felt slighted, and now you're trying to overcome that currently. So I do appreciate the input, and we'll continue to do some of that collab and hope that it rubs off on others.
Yeah, the trouble is that they won't realize that they're shooting themselves in the foot until it's too late. You know, that we're in a situation now which was described well this morning, where we don't have much choice to figure out ways of collaboration. There aren't the resources necessary to tackle the complexity of the issues we face, and we have no choice but to work together. We'll work together, not just amongst ourselves, have always worked together to bring in others who can make a contribution and may even bring different resources to the table. And I think that's almost like a strategic planning exercise across all the governments and institutions in your area to make that happen.
We do have another question, and the question is, could you further explain the Minnesota case study and how it managed the consolidated funding?
The consolidated funding is not quite that, but it's a way of making sure that the funding streams are paid attention to. No, there's no such thing yet as total consolidated funding. Much as I'd like to see it, and I made that point this morning, is that that's the way certainly a lot of people are thinking now, is that we have to break down the funding streams and the silos. Many of you may have seen the Brookings study that done last year, which showed there were 430 different organizations and funding streams relevant to rural. And you really do need to figure out how to combine those and use them in a much more innovative and creative way. So in Minnesota, they've done this through people talking to each other, sharing information and what have you, and making sure that they don't overlap, or that there is some synergistic relationship between each of these programs. I wouldn't pretend, and I don't think anybody in Minnesota would pretend it's perfect, but it's certainly closer to what I've seen in other parts of the country. I'm not seeing many faces and a lot of turned off microphones. It would be good if we all pretend that we're in a room together and have a chat. Could you?
So I believe, Sean, was that a follow-up question that you had with your hand being raised, or was it addressed?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to ask about that because I've been in a lot of conversations lately about that with food systems in Illinois. There's a lot of programs, state, federal, and foundations that cover, one will cover, say, beginning farming or local foods. One will handle food hubs or banks, and one will handle like cooperative development or some other retail farmers markets, but not looking at it as a whole system. And one of the issues is, how do you consolidate that kind of funding, because no one wants to give up their money,
No, but just think how much more effective each of them would be individually if they saw themselves as part of a system rather than responsible for just one small part of it, which isn't, ultimately, an individual program isn't going to move the needle one little bit. But all the programs working together in some sort of systematic way to tackle these complex issues could indeed move the needle. So I think it just requires leadership again, and saying, okay, we're going down the tubes unless we don't start to pull ourselves together. We do have these resources. We complain we have no money, but here are 17 organizations, each with their own budget, and they're all keeping it to themselves. If we put it together, they don't have to put it into a single pot, but if they found a way of coordinating those, then together they could be so much more effective. And I know that this is much harder than I'm saying. I wasn't born yesterday, but you've got to be able to make some progress towards that. Otherwise, we just keep adding more and more useless programs to it. And it's not going to make a darn bit of difference to the future of rural America. So let's figure out a way how to use our limited resources better. Sorry.
Oh, and when you look at that consolidated funding, to somewhat elaborate on that, I used to sit on a loan committee board, and what they did was they pooled their money together, and they would do financing of certain projects that would come together with, 10 different banks that were together, and they pooled their money. One of the challenges that I saw is that they could not take off their banker hat without looking at the project for what it was intended to do. So I think with that Minnesota case study, that was a good example, but there are certainly challenges, as Dr. Dabson had shared, making sure that they all have a shared vision and goal for what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
I do see two other hands raised. We'll go to the first one, which is Susan. If you could unmute your mic and turn on your camera if you can.
My mic is unmuted. My camera, for some reason, doesn't seem to be working. So all I have is a blue screen. So I apologize for that. So I work in community development here with University of Illinois Extension. And the question that I have for you is kind of the challenge that we see for regions. I'm located in the southernmost part of the state, and whether we're looking at something across a 5-county region or a 16-county region, we always hear the phrase that the rising tide lifts all boats. And that really doesn't seem to apply in all situations. I mean, some portions of the region continue to spiral up, counties and communities, and others are continuing in a downward spiral. And it really, I think, goes back to capacity and their ability to respond. I mean, we can bring them together across a region, but those that have the capacity and the leadership in place, they're not willing to wait for the communities that are not ready to proceed. And so they continue moving forward and moving on, get a little frustrated with the ones who aren't at that level. And so it really, sadly, doesn't seem to change. And so I didn't know if you had any thoughts on or success stories that you saw around that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, what you just described is a painfully familiar scenario from all over the United States. But the only thing that, and I hate to keep repeating this almost as a mantra, is that, and I think the new State Director from RD mentioned it this morning, is that there are assets in every community that you can build on. And I know the issue about capacity, but it gets back to the point I've just been making, is that even in the poorest community, there are communities or group of counties, there is some capacity. It's a question of how do you make best use of that capacity going forward. And the sort of organization you're with the University Extension, has a good, I don't know in Illinois, but certainly in Missouri, where I used to be, had a great track record of being able to work with local communities and help them through planning processes and others and apply for resources and what have you. But it would be better still if there were some organizations within the region which could be tapped, and they might be an unusual body. It may not be a usual suspect. It could be the hospital, it could be the utility company, it could be a foundation which was willing to bring folks together and identify who the people are who haven't been at the table before, who might be able to make a contribution, and where are the pockets of resources tucked away in people's drawers and back pockets around the area. So I know that this sounds very trite and not very helpful, but and I understand entirely this business of the annoyance at the rising tides analogy, but I do think that in many communities, there's always more there than meets the eye, if only the people who currently don't participate are brought into the net and share their resources.
Thank you.
We have 2 more hands raised, and we have 1 more minute. So there was a question in regards to a Brookings reference. So yes. I'll get with you after the session if you don't mind, and we can share it with the group. Sure. That way we could get to the last and final question, and we have about 1 minute to answer it.
Okay.
Go ahead, Carol, if you could unmute your mic, please.
There we go. I was wondering, I'm part of an organization that we've started, a network that we've started called the Cures Community Project Lab, which is a group of individuals from universities that have gotten together to say, let's connect all our networks, let's help rural communities, let's leverage each other's strengths, and see how we can find out what communities need and want right now, and help them get access to the projects that would fill their stated needs. So we've taken this approach of putting the community's immediate needs and what they're looking for right now front and center to build the trust. And it means it'll take some time. But do you have some thoughts on, the success, what we could do to, we really want to build that trusting relationship with communities. So we tried to put them front and center, surveyed their needs, identify projects that would fit with the needs that they identified, and help put them in front of communities. With the goal of putting trust first.
Yeah. The challenge you have is that you're from the outside, offering your services to them, as opposed to them saying we've got needs and who can supply it to us. I'm not saying that you're doing anything wrong. I'm just saying that's that trust piece that needs to be negotiated in some way. So it may well be that from what I've seen is if you can find a community or a group of activists in a particular area, and work with them so that they are very much in control of things, and you are supplying them. The danger from any university is, oh, we know how this should be done, and we've seen it done this way and that way, and people are from universities, and I've been from there, can't help ourselves. We're full of great ideas. But the point is, and I've seen this work really is important in tribal communities, is that you have to listen and let them do the work, and then you're available when they need it. Throwing at them, here's all the 100 things we can do for you, is likely to deter them, as opposed to figuring out a way to let them lead and you listen. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude or anything, because you probably know all about the way forward on this, but in my experience, it's very hard for organizations from the outside to keep their mouth shut and listen to what's really needed. And then that's the way in which trust can be developed over time. Does that make any sense to you, Carol?
Well, it does, and it's exactly what we're trying to do, is break this mold of us explaining what we think should be done, and instead understanding their needs and their priorities, and collecting that information, and then working with them and the other agencies and community organizations to help just facilitate what they asked for.
Okay.
Well, thank you for your question. We
Thank
are
you.
out of time. I will send an email to an individual that had his hand raised, and then I'll follow up with you to make sure that your question was addressed. And if it was not, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and send that to you by email, and we'll get that answered for you.
Okay.
Otherwise, excellent session. Thank you so much for your time, and appreciate the collaboration.